In the mountains of the world, there are legends about half-human, elusive creatures that haunt the wilderness. Yeti, Sasquatch, Bigfoot. But in the Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Northwest, there's a legend of another mysterious, seldom-seen being. Half man, half mountain goat, some say, a rock-hardened soul that scales the rugged peaks of mountains as if they were a playground jungle gym. His name? Fred Beching. For more than 5 decades, Fred Beching has been the first to the summits of hundreds of peaks in North America, China, India, Africa, wherever the Earth's crust juts into the sky. The master of the first ascent, 69-year-old Beching, has left his mark on the names he has bestowed: Forbidden Peak, Crooked Thumb, Cruel Finger, Fury, Dragon Teeth. Today, Beching's 3-volume Cascade Alpine Guide is the Bible for the young climber grappling for the same heights of inspiration. As one writer notes, Fred Beching is the rarest form of legend, one who's still alive.
So it's a pleasure to be here. I've given one other talk here in Missoula. I forget, it was about 6 or 7 years ago. I think it was the same year that Jimmy Carter had to sell one of his peanuts farm to take a pay cut to go to the White House. And so I talked to Dudley and Prada a couple of times, like last year or the year before, about doing another slideshow, and he said, well, he'd look into it. And then finally I called him up this year and said if you couldn't get a slideshow going this year, I was going to start a sheep ranch on the hill here right above campus. And he didn't want that to happen. So it worked out that I finally showed up here. So without further ado, I could give a lot of introductory talks about mountains all over North America and the world, but we can cover that some other time, or you can read about these things. I've got enough slides that I think we better get started with the program. The first group of pictures I have deal with the Brooks Range. I've got a program that covers mountaineering from Alaska, where it starts, and ends up in Africa. The Brooks Range in Alaska is really a wonderful place, not only for mountaineering, but also for hiking. And the one trip I made there was with several fellows from Seattle and one from Vancouver, British Columbia. And we flew in, drove up to Fairbanks, actually, and then we flew to a town called Battles, and we hired a charter float plane, landed on a little lake here, which is a part of the Alatna River. And in many ways, the Brooks Range reminded me of some of the the mountains of Montana and also Wyoming, very much in some ways like the Wind River Range. It's a lot of nice high plateau country, beautiful mountain flowers. This, incidentally, is a lousewort, and we found that the timberline there is fairly low, only about 2,500 feet above sea level. But the valleys are deep, and there are some very, very spectacular granite peaks. Peak in front is called Albatross, which has only been climbed once, I think. And then in the background, there's a big wall called Xanadu, which is certainly as big and even more formidable than the face of Half Dome in Yosemite. And two of our party climbed the left-hand skyline, did a new route up there. But we found, this is a telephoto shot, and this is actually about 6 miles away. But we had an airdrop in there, and then hiked in, retrieved our airdrop, and spent a couple of weeks in there hiking and climbing various peaks. We found, for instance, that this peak, Xanadu on the left, had very superb rock, where the one aerial in the middle had kind of a metamorphic type rock, and strangely enough, very, very close to the granite, but it was very, very loose. So you couldn't always tell which was going to be a good rock. We put our binoculars on this peak called Caliban, and we could tell right away that it had superb rock, big slabs, very steep ones that remind you of Yosemite, in fact. And so we spent about 4 days climbing routes on or near the left-hand skyline. And this turned out to be really the best rock climbing of the entire trip. We were interested in not only rock climbing, but looking at the scenery. We had, incidentally, a lot of cloudy weather. I thought it would be sunny there all the time. This was during the month of June, and it rained almost never, but it did do some sprinkling. And the other thing that after about 2 weeks of climbing in there, we split up in 2 and 2, and Bob McGregor from Vancouver and I did some climbs, and then we were hiking out a different way. We were becoming apprehensive of the stories we'd heard about some of the grizzly bears in there. So we thought for sure that we'd be seeing a grizzly bear sometime. We kind of wanted to see one, but at the same time we were afraid to see one. And we thought what we'd do is we kept on a very high traverse above timberline so that we would be the ones surprising the bears instead of the bears surprising us. And there's a lot of alder and willow, so one of the house rules around there that I'd heard from rangers and other people in Alaska is to stay away from the alder. So anyway, we came around a corner, and here were these two gigantic bears. The one on the left is the mother bear, and it looked, when we first saw it, at least about twice the size of a VW bus. It probably wasn't, but that furry thing to the right, I guess, is the cub. The reason that picture is kind of out of focus and fuzzy is because we were so trembling. We had actually dropped our packs and ran uphill. And later on, I was reminded by somebody these bears have been clocked at 45 miles an hour. And that's not when they're mad. A different part of the Alaska mountains, this is actually in the Alaska Range to the south and west of Anchorage. And it's kind of a reminder of Alaska climbing at nighttime. And much of the climbing in Alaska at lower elevation is best done in the shadow and evening hours. And you can almost read a newspaper if you have good eyesight at nighttime. And this is kind of what it's like. Particularly, there's a lot of snow that hasn't consolidated in the summer months, and it's often best to do your climbing then. Alaska itself as a country and region has so many mountain areas and mountain ranges that you could devote your life to studying them, climbing, hiking, traveling in them, and learning about them, and it'd be almost a futile task because there's just too much. There's maybe more mountains in Alaska than any other region in the world, including the Himalayas. This one range right here that we're covering is called the Revelation Mountains, where they were named by a party that Dave Roberts was involved with back in the late 60s, I recall. And the highest peak here is Hesperus, runs at about 10,000 feet, but it starts from very, very low on a branch of the Kuskokwim River, so you're looking at about 9,000 feet of mountain. In fact, that mountain has only been climbed once, and just a few years ago when the first ascent was made. But most of the peaks in the Revelations have never been climbed. Glaciers haven't been even named or even properly mapped, and all the peaks you see in the background there are unclimbed. I don't mind saying so, but nobody can live long enough to climb all these things. So anybody here from Missoula that wants to make some first ascents, do new routes, maybe have a mountain named for you, or better yet, a glacier named for you. We ended up, after about a week of trying various routes that didn't get too far because of avalanche problems and bad rock, we finally settled on a peak at the head of the valley, which we called Mount Titanic, because the top of it looked like a ship kind of coming out of the ocean of the clouds. And we did kind of a 24-hour climb going up that valley and climbing a glacier that's out of sight, and ended up making a first ascent of that peak. It was a really rewarding climb. The peak itself was maybe about 9,500 feet, but it's probably only one of about maybe 15 or 20 peaks that have ever been climbed in the entire Revelation range. And this range is maybe 30 miles wide and about 90 miles in length. So it's a very, very big mountain range. This is a different part of Alaska in the Wrangell Mountains. Just to give you an idea how big some of the glaciers are, you're looking across the glacier. It's probably right here about 2 miles wide, and you can see some of the medial moraines, kind of like these two lines look like streetcar tracks going down. Those are medial moraines that have come from right to left. And we had just finished a climb and had gotten off of the Fern or Neve, taken our snowshoes off, which we were using on that trip, and we were walking on the hard glacier ice, and we actually have about 15 miles to walk down this glacier to a gravel bar, which eventually would take us off of the glacier. A few random shots of several expeditions in the Alaska mountains. This was in a range called the Mount Hayes Group to the east of Mount McKinley. This is what our tents looked like after a 3-day snowstorm. And what we did there is just eat up all our lunch food, because it was just too much trouble to cook there while these storms were raging. On another trip, the storms, the way it worked out, happened before we came there, and you can see we dug a big pit around here. And it's very important on some of these, particularly the higher peaks like Mount Foraker and Hunter, and of course in the high peaks in the St. Elias Mountains, that you dig your tents in a pit or have a big snowball wall around, because the storms can be just tremendous there and can just devastate your tents. These are old-fashioned North Face tents made by the St. Elias model, which aren't being used very much anymore. Now the dome tents are much in favor. But this is actually taken on a climbing expedition not very far from Mount Hubbard Kennedy and just to the south of Mount Logan in the Icefield Ranges. A picture taken on Mount St. Elias, which I got involved with on an expedition. We never managed to get to the top of the peak because we had logistic problems with our support from the airplanes. But here we are at about 11,000 feet, way above the clouds, and we're looking out westward out here toward the Pacific. And we found on this trip here that snowshoes were better than skis because we had a lot of little short, steep slopes to go. And just as a reminder, you can see the crevasse in the background. The big danger here, besides avalanches, is falling into a crevasse, and that's why we stay roped up in a location like this. Going from the St. Elias Range back to the Alaska Range, this is a peak called the Moose's Tooth, kind of in the shadow of Mount McKinley. The shadow of Mount McKinley goes in every direction, but there are some absolutely spectacular and incredible peaks that are anywhere from 9,000 to 12,000 feet, all within about 30 miles of Mount McKinley, almost in every direction except straight north. And some of these peaks here, this one is called the Rooster Comb. Mount Huntington is nearby, the Moose's Tooth. If they were anywhere else in the world, just on their own right, they would be considered some of the world's most spectacular peaks, and you'd see entire books about them just alone. And today, only a few technical climbers even go here, although there's been some hard climbs. Even Europeans have come here. But most of the people that go to this part of Alaska, for obvious reasons, instead of going here to peaks like the Moose's Tooth, want to go to Mount McKinley. And McKinley itself is a great magnet, being the highest mountain in North America, and certainly one of the most well-known and amazing mountains in the entire world. The only trip I've ever made to McKinley was this one expedition which I got together with some people who were actually living in Alaska, and we did a new route on this northwest buttress, which ended up on the North Summit, which is the second highest summit. We spent about a month on the expedition. We flew in with a ski plane on a frozen lake, and then we cut loose and did the climb kind of expedition style for a while, which means we ferried up our camps and carried loads, went back and forth like a caterpillar does, setting up our camps, and then we got up to about 15,000 feet. We climbed the mountain for the rest of the way by alpine style, which means cutting loose from your camps and going for the summit. We had a lot of climbing here in very, very good weather. This slope here is not terribly steep, but it's about 40, 45 degrees, and it's kind of tricky. It looks like like an easy snow slope, but there's about maybe 8 inches of powdery type snow with a little crust on top, and underneath it's all blue ice, very, very slippery stuff. So we want to stay roped up. We use some ice screws here and there, and of course wear our crampons. What's interesting in the background for anybody who's interested in geology, and I'm sure a lot of you are, you can see that black schist, which is wedged right there into the granite. This rock here is a granitic batholith, a large mass of it. In fact, the entire Mount McKinley Massif is composed of that, but there are many areas of this very, very black schist, and if nothing else, it gives you some bearings here. You can remember what the blackness looks like, and it maybe is a guide to route finding, so it's kind of interesting. This was one of our last camps, I think around 15,000 feet or so. This was our next to the highest camp. We actually kept that tent there because it was falling apart. And we, 5 of us went up to a higher camp, and we actually slept, 5 of us in one tent. And we spent about 5 days up there and managed to get to the top of the North Peak. But the storms were so bad that we just didn't have time or food left over to finally make a try on the South Peak, which is the true summit, which was about 3 miles away. And after coming down, after the storm let up, we had a lot of, you can see the fresh snow here, which had all fallen on the slope down below. And this entire slope, we had packed out real well, made a trail and set wands so we could find our way back. But when we came across here, we couldn't see any of the wands. They'd either blown over or had been filled in, and we actually had to shovel our way across this long slope. It was actually, I think, about a mile across. And here again, you can see the danger of these funny marks here are almost all of them hidden crevasses. So, in fact, we were afraid enough of the hidden crevasses so that the 5 of us just kept roped together most of the time on 2 ropes. So if somebody did fall in, we'd have plenty of backing. After walking out, we incidentally had to carry all our gear, and we had some movie film too on top of that. And we finally had got up to the tundra, and by that time the snow had melted around here, and the snow had gone, and the mosquitoes had come out, and we had to wade the McKinley Fork River. There were, in this case, about 14 braids. A lot of it actually went up right to your waist, and it was kind of a difficult crossing that spent several hours going across. We got pretty close to some grizzly bears on that particular trip also. In fact, we had a bear follow us for a while. I don't think he saw us, but he was wondering what we looked, who we were. Don Sheldon, who's a legendary bush pilot, one of the best-known figures in American aviation, and he started the bush flying business to the McKinley area with ski airplanes, and we used him on a flight to Mount Deborah. 3 of us went to Mount Deborah to make the first ascent of it. Henry Maybaum, who you can see here in the checkered shirt, and then Heinrich Harrer, who of course is world famous for his being involved with the team that made the first ascent of the Eiger, and of course he wrote the book 7 Years in Tibet. So the 3 of us got together and set forth after Sheldon landed us on the Yanruk Glacier, and in 5 really perfect days of weather and going alpine style, we worked our way up various glacier segments, ice falls, and found ourselves on the south ridge of Mount Deborah, which is a peak about 12,300 feet high, about 8,000 feet lower than Mount McKinley, but quite a lot more difficult. Harrer is the fellow with the cowboy hat there, sun hat I should say, and Maybaum's on the left. And after we reached the edge of the south ridge, we had to climb along that sharp ridge. It's actually almost a half a mile along that ridge to the summit. And what helped us out here is 2 things. One thing is that the cornices that we were on never collapsed. We were wondering about those all the time. The other thing that helped a lot is we had perfect weather, and that when you have good weather like that and you can see all night, everything is with you. The thing that finally wears out is your strength. So I think we, after climbing about 18 hours from our high camp, we finally got to the summit, and I think it was about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. You can see it isn't even perfectly dark, so we spent about an hour or so up there eating something, taking a little bit of a break, and then we had to do this long, very careful descent along this same ridge to get back to our camp. We spent about a week in Talkeetna getting ready for another trip. This one's to Mount Hunter. Here's a shot of the skis on the Piper Cub that Don Sheldon had. We kept together as a group and flew in to Mount Hunter. I think somebody loaned us this tent, and it's still up there. We didn't have an awful lot of use for it after that trip. So we took a smaller and lighter tent up on Mount Hunter. And this is a shot from the Hilton Glacier of Mount Hunter, kind of the northwest face. And it's very much the same view that you get from the Mount McKinley base camp. A little cornice here had collapsed. A lot of dangers in these mountains that don't meet the eye. You think a little cornice like this would be so small it wouldn't collapse, but it must have just fallen apart just before we got there. And you can see our tent pitched right on the edge of it. It was about the only place we could pitch it. And you can see our tracks going up along the cornice ridge. We did some of our climbing here, at least the lower part, during the daytime. And then later on, as we got higher on the mountain, we climbed through the night to take advantage of better snow conditions. Interesting to note, this cornice up here near the top of the picture leans out, I'd say, at least 50 or 75 feet, and our route went right across that slope. And of course, that's the problem in these climbs like that. You're looking instantly downhill along the ridge. You don't want to get out too close to the edge of the cornice for obvious reasons, but you also don't want to get too far down the rounded part, because that part is liable to have some wind slab danger or some wind crust, and of course it makes the climbing a lot tougher to be on a steeper slope. Looking again up the slope, this is a fairly steep ice wall that we climbed up along this ridge. This ridge itself extends for about 5 miles from its base up to the top of Mount Hunter. We made our last camp, I think, about elevation of about 10,000 feet. The summit of Mount Hunter is almost 15,000 feet, so we were gone about 28, 30 hours on that climb round trip. And this is kind of a little evening lunch break that we made right here on the upper slopes of the Hunter. We actually had to go across this kind of a diving board cornice, which was pretty easy actually, traversing on the right side, and then going through that crack up there that looks like a couple of jaws. We call it the Nutcracker. And then we found ourselves on top of Hunter in early July. You can see this is, I think, about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and you can see in the background the second highest peak of the Alaska Range, Mount Foraker, which is not as high as Mount McKinley, but it still rises over 17,000 feet in altitude. Heinrich Haar, incidentally, is a fellow in the yellow down parka in the center of the picture. Coming back down Hunter, you can see our tracks, and we actually had to go down along all that narrow cornice ridge right down into the clouds, which actually meant that it was good weather, but when you have low clouds like this near the glacier, it was a high pressure area, and these clouds are just formed from moisture there. It's down there low. Getting away from the Alaska Range, we're going to take a little trip a few years later. Actually, this was in the late 60s, to a mountain called Mount Seattle, which is in the St. Elias Mountains of the Icefield Ranges. They're very close to Yakutat, Alaska. And a group of us from Seattle, one fellow was from Alaska, we took the flight there from Seattle to Yakutat, and all of our gear, after it was unloaded from the plane for a 3-big expedition, fitted kind of carefully on this baggage cart. And you can see our food boxes. And then the weather got so bad that we went into the airplane hangar, and I immediately fell asleep in the Wonder Bread box. Going over some of our logistic problems, we were discussing it with the pilot and some other people in Yakutat. We were originally going to fly and do a ski plane landing on the glacier about 20 miles inland from Russell Fjord or Yakutat Bay. Then we decided, rather than do that, what we would do is take a landing craft or boat into the head of Yakutat Bay. It's got to be one of the most spectacular places in the world where you have huge glaciers, one of them being the Hubbard Glacier, which is out of sight on the right. It's 100 miles long, and the Variegated Glacier here, which right now is surging or moving at a very, very fast rate. And what we did is actually snowshoe in from during the month of May, right from the water's edge up this kind of a draw and up to the high camp on Mount Seattle, which is around 7,000 feet above sea level. This took us a couple of weeks to get up there and get organized because we started right from sea level. And here I'm doing a radio walkie-talkie contact with somebody at a different camp. And then from here, we had to wait a few days while a storm took place, and then we made our ascent to the top of Mount Seattle. It's a 10,000-foot peak, not very high compared to some other peaks in the St. Elias Mountains, but nevertheless, considering the fact you're starting right from sea level, it's a very major and lengthy undertaking. We had some storms there, and unfortunately, when we had to do the summit climb on a very, very foggy day, so we couldn't get much in the way of pictures. We were kind of sponsored by a King Broadcasting Company from Seattle. It's actually King Television, so the negative part of that, I guess, is that we had to take a lot of movies and also bring along a flag, so which I guess they put on a billboard. And we came back to Seattle, and they had this sign all over the billboards. So another trip I made to the St. Elias Mountains was to the other side, the Canadian side, the Yukon Territory, which here we have a view of Kluane Lake, which is the biggest lake in the Yukon. In fact, it's right on the Alaska Highway. Anybody who drives that highway will see Kluane Lake. And on this trip in the 1970s, a group of us flew in to the icefield ranges with the ski plane. This one is a Helio Courier, a very efficient small plane that has a very powerful plane for its size, and it can land in a short distance and also take off in a short distance. Our objective on this trip was a mountain called Mount Foresta, which you can see part of in the background. This climb was not terribly difficult, but it was very dangerous, and we had to kind of climb up that helmet, which is not the top, but there's a lot of seracs or big ice blocks, and these can break off almost at any time unannounced, and there was really no perfectly safe route through there, and you had to take a fair amount of chances just hoping nothing would let loose when you were below it. But we did what we could and put a camp up behind the helmet, and then from there we had a fairly easy summit ridge. The only problem is that on the summit ridge, which I think we spent about 10 hours climbing, is that when we were about a quarter of a mile before the summit, I suddenly felt the snow give away from me, and I suddenly fell into a hole. I was actually down in this crevasse about 50 feet. And when I was working my way out with Prussic knots and Jumars, my friends were having lunch here and still belaying. Of course, they took a picture of me when I was down there. Incidentally, in a mountain far in the distance, almost 100 miles away, is the second highest peak in North America. It's the highest in Canada, and that's Mount Logan. It's a very, very big mountain, even actually bulk-wise bigger than Mount McKinley. So after I'd gotten out of the crevasse and kind of thawed myself out, we took a picture on the summit of Mount Foresta. It's actually one of the more dramatic places I think I've ever been, because you can look down from the summit about 11,000 feet right down to there to the water of a fjord off the ocean, Yakutat Bay and Russell Fjord, and you can see the Hubbard Glacier, which is the one on the left. And that glacier actually is hard to believe, but it's over 5 miles wide at that point. A mountain in the Juneau Icefield, Devil's Paw. There are some amazingly spectacular peaks along the Alaska Coast Range and also the British Columbia Coast Range. Climb that we did on Devil's Paw up a long 3,000-foot snow couloir. You can see the big runnels here caused by avalanches. Climbing in the Coast Range can vary from climbing on ice fields like that, like we just saw, where you can ski across spectacular alpine peaks all the way down to sea level, where there's a lot of waterfalls, a great deal of brush, and a lot of grizzly bears. We came in once to do a climb near Ketchikan, a place called the Beam Canal, where there are some massive granite walls, very much like Yosemite. The only difference is they never dry out, and most of the time they're in the clouds. So we spent most of our time here fighting brush to get up to the base of the climb. Then we got on the rock, we found every crack was full of moss, and kind of gave up on a serious climb. So by the time the trip was over, we spent most of our time waiting for the pilot, I think 2 or 3 days, getting clams and mussels off the beach and learning how to cook seafood. Taking a camera jump, the first expedition I made to Asia was one organized by a Swiss group. There were 3 Americans, several Austrians, and 4 people from Switzerland that went on an attempt to climb Lhotse. This is actually before Lhotse was climbed. And here's a view of the foothills of the Himalaya, where we are back toward the high peaks. You can look up toward Mount Everest, and this was in the post-monsoon period. A lot of the time, the weather, and when we hiked in, we actually hiked in right from the border of India, and the weather would be very good in the morning, it would clear up, but then this monsoon clouds were still here, and then by about noon, usually these clouds would envelop you, and you'd just be in a mist. And the biggest problem we had for about 3 weeks of crossing of these Himalaya and these convoluted mountain ranges was going across some of these really wild torrents. over these, and we had to cross these by these little narrow rickety bridges, which are just as unstable as Charles Manson is. And these things are very, very wobbly, and I felt after I crossed one of these I should get the Purple Heart. And we incidentally had several Sherpas with us, and it had about 50 coolies carrying loads. Very spectacular. I might mention that the Himalayas here are very, very convoluted with steep valleys and ravines, and the Himalayas are a very, very young mountain range, have just been risen to their altitude by the collision of two plates. Actually a lithospheric plate that came off the Indian Ocean, moved into the mainland of Asia, and less than the mountains themselves have been formed within the last 40 or so million years, and they are still rising, although at a very, very slow rate. However, our thoughts here were not about geology. Our thoughts were about staying alive on these little narrow baskets. And afterwards, I kind of shudder to think of what the belaying system here was and what kind of quality of ropes. I think these are just sisal or bamboo ropes. We didn't even have any nylon ropes along for this sort of thing. But they would have been worse maybe because they would have stretched more. When we finally got up to the high country, we were really glad to have the rivers behind us, and by that time we decided never to go back that way. We were going to hike overland back to Kathmandu, which the leader, Norman Deerenforth, promised us would be no more river crossings like that. We got our first real view of Mount Everest, which you can see on the left there, and Lhotse on the right, from the Thangboche Monastery, which is a famous monastery in the high country of Nepal, very close to Mount Everest, at about 13,000 feet in altitude. A couple of Tibetan ladies with some of their ornamental costumes and jewelry, and the ever-present prayer flags, which you can see right there in the background. Telephoto shot of a peak that's become kind of famous through all the photography, and that one is Amadablam. Amadablam, again, it must be one of the most beautiful mountains in the world. Anybody who's interested in what glaciers do, this is a great example of a moraine that was formed here, a lateral moraine actually, by glacial action at some time in the past. Some of this very, very dramatic peaks that are in that Mount Everest area called the Solo Khumbu, and the land, of course, of the Sherpas. We had a group of them. These are the Sherpas that helped us on our trip, and really a wonderful group of people, and they have now, of course, established themselves as not only premier mountaineers, but also really wonderful companions, and we certainly could not have done very well on that trip without them. What we did on that particular trip is make an attempt on Lhotse, and we had such bad weather after the monsoon that we really couldn't get up more than about halfway up the Lhotse face, which you see in the background. The summit of Lhotse is not really a terribly difficult technical climb, but it is one of the highest mountains in the world, I think one of the 5th or 6th highest, and the south column of Mount Everest is on the upper corner of the picture, and then the route to the south ridge of Everest is just out of sight on the left. And a Swiss fellow, Bruno Spirig, and I took skis along, short skis, and they really have no advantage, I think, in going up there, but we did ski up to about 22,000 feet, and we actually put a camp up further on the Lhotse face, but the weather was so bad that we finally just had to give up any serious try at climbing Lhotse. So after that part of the expedition was over, Dick McGowan and George Bell and I, who were the 3 Americans, got about 6 Sherpas to help us backpack over to a peak called Langcha, which you see in the background is close to 21,000 feet high, and we made the first ascent of that peak, and that was actually one of the more really nicest alpine climbs that I've ever made. We were actually able to do the whole climb from a high camp in one day. I think it took us about a day and night to get up it, but it was really a very, very good climb. A very, very high lake in Nepal, and some spectacular sharp peaks in the background. I think at that time these peaks hadn't been climbed, but there are just so many summits like this, many of which are still unclimbed, that you could, of course, do a whole slide program just of climbing in that part of the world. Taking a camera jump from Asia to North America, not so far from here actually. This is in the Selkirk Range of British Columbia, a place called St. Mary's Alpine Park, not very far from Cranbrook and Kimberley, British Columbia, taken in the fall when the large trees are just changing color. I'd recommend anybody from here who wants to find a place to hike to get away from, especially in the fall season when the trees change color and the snow might fall. It's really a beautiful place to go to. And of course, this is very similar in many ways to Glacier Park and some of the other peaks, areas of both the Purcell Range and the Selkirks. Canada, of course, sure many of you know this, has some of the world's more spectacular, interesting mountain ranges. This is a view of a mountain called Mount Lees in the Purcell Range, which is to the west and parallel to the Canadian Rockies. And during a climb here of this particular mountain, we actually had to walk in about 25 miles to the road and do the climb and come back. And it's no wonder that the climb has probably only been climbed maybe 2 or 3 times ever. Most of the peaks in Canada involve not only ice climbing, but rock climbing, various degrees of difficulty. On this particular climb, we had to go over a kind of an awkward bergschrund problem and actually wear our crampons on rock because we needed them right above. There would be no place to change the crampons. So what would ordinarily be about easy 5th class rock climbing turned into be quite serious rock climbing and hard to protect. And then you also had to have your ice axe with you and to start doing ice climbing afterwards. A climb that Dave Polari, who's from Missoula, and Jim Roots from Seattle, and I did just a few years ago was this glacier right here, kind of a cataract type glacier on a mountain called Moby Dick in the Selkirk Range just a few years ago. There are many new climbs to do, old and new, of course, in both the Selkirk Range and the Purcells. The Purcell Range, of course, isn't very well known as a name or word, but it has the bugaboos in them, which of course are very, very well known. Just a few shots from some of the early climbs I did in the bugaboos. This is the west side of Snowpatch Spire, and a climb I did with Brian Greenwood as an English climber, and Hank Mather, who's a German climber, then living in Vancouver. We made our first ascent route on the west face of Snowpatch Spire. Then Mather and I got together and made the first really big route in the bugaboos. This is the east face of Snowpatch Spire. We did a route, I think it's about 1,800 feet in height. We spent 5 days kind of hammering and free climbing up the wall that you see in the background. And the lucky thing is that the lightning never struck and that the pitons held, and also maybe more important is the weather stayed good the whole time. And this is kind of almost a comic shot with all the gear we had, but you have to remember at that time we were using these metal rung aluminum slings because the Italians were using them. And I guess at that time the thing to do is do as the Italians do. And I think most of our carabiners were steel carabiners, so you kind of become, if I have any stooped shoulders, that's the reason for it. And the ropes were, well, we had nylon ropes, but there were these Columbia nylon, which was not as good as the Kern mantle, and we also didn't have, Jumars hadn't been invented. I think they came another year later, so we had to go by prusik slings on pitches that we'd already climbed before. Looking upward, later on, after 2 days of direct aid climbing, things got to be a little bit more fun. We could climb free, and the only problem is we had some big wide cracks and we didn't know how to deal with them. We had these bongs, which are aluminum bongs that Chenard had kind of invented. And then we also dragged along some wooden wedges that we got from somebody in Europe. They're made out of oak. I think the oak came from the East Coast. They were sent to Europe to made into bongs and they were shipped back. It's sort of like the same thing that goes on now with products made in Japan. And then we climbed these really steep cracks for about 2 days to finally found ourselves on the top of Snowpatch Spire after doing a really rewarding climb. Another climb, this is I did with Greenwood. This was a serious route on the west face of the Hauser Spires, which actually are the highest spires in the Bugaboo group, and a route I did with Yvon Chenard on the east face of the south tower of Hauser Spire. This is actually the west face of the big Hauser Spire, which probably still has some unclimbed lines on it. It's very much like an alpine Yosemite. And one of the biggest dangers of climbing in the Bugaboos or any of these Canadian mountains, well, there's two big problems there. One is these little rodents called, they're actually Columbia ground squirrels, but local climbers call them schnaffelhounds. The big danger is that while you're off climbing is that they'll eat your food up. And then secondly, if you've left any fixed ropes, you'll come back and see the rope chewed through. And of course, the other danger is lightning storms, which are quite a serious threat. There have been a number of people killed, not only in the Bugaboos, but other nearby ranges from lightning, and you never really know when it's going to hit. If you think you're going to get hit by a lightning storm, you'll never leave camp. So sometimes you just have to take chances. The mountain in the background is Mount Sir Donald, which is often called the Canadian Matterhorn. It's on the Rogers Pass Highway, on the Trans-Canada Highway, and this picture was taken during a winter ascent, which we made in the very late 60s. Four of us made a winter climb of Sir Donald by more or less the regular route, and the conditions in winter at this particular time were so good we didn't even rope up until we got about 3 pitches below the summit, and the weather had been really good for a couple of weeks, so we had excellent snow conditions, so we made pretty fast time. By the time we got to the top, it got very cold. You can see us all buttoned up with our clothes up tight, and the clouds are starting to come in. We just managed to get down off the peak before the weather changed, and that was kind of a lucky one. A few shots, random shots of some of the mountains in the Selkirks. This is part of the Valhalla group, which is really not that far north of Spokane, just across the Canadian border. The peak is called Gimli, and this one is climbing on Mount Tupper, just across the highway from Mount Sir Donald. Very, very good rock. Actually, it's a gneissic type rock that is very, very good for climbing. On that particular climb, we had to do some aid climbing as well as free climbing. Some of the problems of climbing in the Canadian mountains is that except for the national parks, you seldom have trails. And in climbing in the northern Selkirks, we had to cross some pretty violent rivers. A picture here of the Rampart group. The Ramparts are some very, very interesting peaks not very far from Jasper, Alberta. And much of the Canadian Rockies is formed out of limestone or dolomite rock. Actually, a lot of it is pre-Cambrian rock. But the rock here in the northern part of the Canadian Rockies near Jasper, a lot of it is a very, very solid rock, quartzite actually. And this area is actually not very far from Mount Robson. And these peaks here are called the Ramparts. There's a wall of peaks about 6 miles in length, and they offer some very, very interesting rock climbing. Also an excellent place for ski touring in the winter. A quick view here of Mount Edith Cavell, a route that Yvonne Chenard, Dan Duty, and I climbed in 1961. We did the front face of Edith Cavell, which you can see from Jasper. It's a pace of about 3,700 feet in height, and it become a fairly interesting and popular technical alpine climb. A view here of Mount Robson being the highest peak in the Rockies, almost 13,000 feet in altitude, just to the northwest of Jasper. And the only time I've managed to climb Robson after a couple of summer tries was during the winter. You can see Robson in the background beyond that cabin. And here you can see the northwest face of Robson from across from Berg Lake. We actually skied in there, spent I think a couple of days making a ski approach from the Canadian National Railroad, and then from there we got up on the glacier to the northwest side of Robson, and during a clear period during the month of March, we made the ascent and had really very, very good snow conditions. And I managed to get to the top of Robson about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on an absolutely perfect day. There was no wind at all and no clouds, and the atmosphere is just extremely clear. And it was maybe one of the more rewarding summits that I've ever been on. Robson really gives you the feeling of being on top of something. You really can look off in all directions. Some peaks in the Cascades near Monte Cristo, which was once a very, very famous mining mecca. The Rockefeller interest developed a lot of mines in there around the turn of the century, and there are many, many mines and still some old cableways going up to the tops of some of these peaks. This is a wintertime shot in the Cascades, where sometimes you can have some very good winter conditions, and then sometimes, just like here in Montana, you can have some very, very heavy snows. The snows that you get in the Cascades have eventually developed into many glaciers. Ever since the Ice Ages, the Cascades have been covered by ice ages, by glaciers, and a lot of these glaciers, of course, have receded, but there still are some large glaciers in the Cascades. Actually, there are over 700 glaciers in the North Cascades alone, which is more than any place in the United States in one area except Alaska, of course. Some of the peaks have been carved into Matterhorn shapes, like El Dorado Peak in the background and the small pyramid in the foreground. The big thing about the Cascades maybe that is different than most of the other North American ranges is that the peaks are very closely formed together. The valleys are narrow and deep, many beautiful lakes left over, most of them as a result of glacier recession. The glaciers have scooped out basins, and later on they were filled up with water. A lot of the valleys are covered with timber up to about 5,000 feet in altitude. Timberline is much lower in the Cascades than it is in the both American and Canadian Rockies. A couple of ptarmigans, which I managed to get fairly close to on a climb. And then Lake Chelan is one of the biggest lake in the North Cascades. It's almost 50 miles in length, and one of my trips we sailed the catamaran sailboat to the head and did some climbing. Another trip to the North Cascades, we had kind of an interesting experience. We found this log across the Agnes River, which was in high foaming period right now because there was a lot of snow melt, and it turned out the Forest Service bridge had washed out, so we either had a choice of climbing across this log in crampons or forgetting it and going home. We also roped up, and we luckily had some pitons with us, so you can't tell with your eye, but we had driven several pitons in there to safeguard it in case he fell off. I guess he lost the coin for leading that pitch, but this is actually Leif Patterson, who was a good climber, was later killed in an avalanche. But we kept thinking about if anybody had slipped off the log, you'd be hanging upside down. I don't know how you'd ever get back up on the log again. So we didn't like that particular log, so we went back a different way. We had to pay the penalty of fighting about 6 miles of devil's club and brush, but it was better than getting drowned in a river, I guess. Some views of the Cascades, little basins here. You can see a glacier in the background called the Lyman Glacier, and ice calving off into the water, and that beautiful green-blue color is due to the glacial silt suspended in the water. A small but steep glacier on the backside of a mountain called Mont Furneaux. A peak called Forbidden Peak in the North Cascades. It's been featured in a number of books, including 50 classic, sometimes called crowded climbs. It has become very, very popular, and people almost have to take a number and stand in line during the summer months, but it is a nice climb. This is on the north ridge of Forbidden, and looking back at some of the peaks in the North Cascades taken on a perfect day. Climbing a glacier on the north side of Mount Baker, and a picture I took just a few years ago of right on the Canadian border, a peak called Mount Rideout. We did a steep snow and ice gully. Working on a guidebook during a rest break. I'm either taking notes on the climb or writing down some girl's phone number that I just thought of. North face of Bear Mountain, which Mark Fielding and I climbed in the late 60s. Very spectacular buttress of granite rock, and one of the more challenging north face areas in the entire Cascades. There have been a number of steep routes done, including that direct diamond right under the summit. Some peaks that are not very well known. Actually, these peaks are called the Illusion Peaks, and they're only about 20 miles away from the Trans-Canada Highway in the Fraser Valley, but it's hard to see them unless you get to the right place, and this happens to be one of the right places. But not many climbs have been done here because it's hard to access them, and you have to do some brush fighting and do some steep slab climbing. But it's really a great example of what the glaciers have done sometime in the last, maybe last 100,000 years, certainly during the Wisconsin stage about 18 to 20,000 years ago. The glaciers smoothed out these rock walls. The rock wall on the right looks very much like Glacier Point Apron, and the rock in here is really excellent, and there's a lot of climbing opportunity for anybody who wants to climb in the future. There's still new routes to do right here within about 70 miles of Vancouver, British Columbia in the Illusion Peaks. Mont Slessy, which is certainly a really spectacular peak right on the Canadian side of the 49th parallel. This is a shot taken in winter from an airplane, and it's kind of spectacular because the sun is very low, and of course that casts your shadows sideways instead of up and down. Liberty Bell, which is right next to the North Cascades Highway across north of Seattle and also north of Lake Chelan. This is taken in the fall when there's a lot of fresh snow. Not a good time for climbing, but a good time for taking pictures. A few climbing shots on Liberty Bell. This is a route called the Serpentine Crack, which I made a new route on one time on the west face of Liberty Bell. And this is a picture taken of the east face of Liberty Bell. You can see the Liberty Crack route, which again was featured in the the book 50 Classic Climbs, and it kind of goes starting right down here in the snow, right above here, and it goes over this overhanging lip, and it goes on right after about 12 pitches up to the summit, and it's become a fairly popular and safe technical climb. If you look carefully here, you can see somebody in an orange outfit just going over the seconding the lip, which is actually about 12 feet out. It's a real overhang. It's been since direct aid climbing. You can see somebody else belaying just above there. It's a foreshortened view because the camera is tilted upward, and there's actually above that still 9 more pitches to go to the summit. A shot taken a place called the Giant Cleft, just on the Canadian side of the Pasayten Wilderness. We had seen pictures of this in a Canadian magazine. We're hoping to stem this cleft for about a full pitch, and we found out that you'd have to be about 8 foot tall to get your legs out to stem it. So we did the next best thing and rappelled down it and take some pictures. A climb here taken on the Squamish Chief, which again is a major climbing area. Climb on the Index Town Wall near Seattle, and some basalt columns along the Columbia River, actually about halfway from Seattle to Spokane, not too far from Yakutat, called the Royal Columns, and these are made out of basalt pillars, and there are some interesting jam crack problems. It's becoming a fairly popular climbing area during the off-season. Climbing on some pinnacles in the Mount Stewart area. Mount Stewart is a high granitic peak sort of halfway between Seattle and the Columbia River, actually closer to the Columbia, and there's many granite crags, turrets, and pinnacles, and offers some very, very good rock climbing. Some of the rock climbing in the Leavenworth area to the east of Seattle takes place in the Peshastin Pinnacles and also along Tumwater Canyon and the Icicle Canyon. And these are just some random shots of some of the early climbs of routes there. At one time when I was belaying, we saw this long snake. It looked like a big rattlesnake, but it just turned out to be a bull snake. But it pretty much scared me when I was belaying, and somebody took a picture of me in a high degree of fright. Some climbing clothes that I wore when I didn't want anybody to take pictures of me, and climbing on the Peshastin Pinnacles here before the advent of the new stealth rubber. I think these were Kronhofer shoes. This area, incidentally, has become fixed up with new bolts and made into a state park, so anybody from Montana who gets lost and takes the wrong road to Vegas, finds himself near Seattle, might consider coming here to the Peshastin Pinnacles and climbing either in the spring or fall. They put in a new pub there. They make their own beer now, so that maybe is another reason to go there. This is a rappelling off of something called trigger finger, which has since fallen off, so it's no longer there. So you're seeing a rappel that's no longer possible. Mount Rainier is the only picture I have. Again, one could do an entire slideshow of Mount Rainier. I'm sure everybody pretty well knows that it's the bulkiest and largest mountain in the lower 48, a little bit over 14,000 feet. There is several peaks in both the Sierra Nevada and also Colorado that are higher than Rainier, but there's certainly none more majestic. Mount Rainier has 26 glaciers. This is a telephoto shot taken from near Puget Sound from maybe 60 miles away. The popular route on Rainier is what they call the Gibraltar route on the right. They go around to climb behind Gibraltar on Disappointment Cleaver, and there's as many as 5,000 people a year climbing Rainier, most of them on the same weekend. So I'd recommend anybody who doesn't want to step on yellow snow and see a lot of people in front and behind them, try a different route than the regular route on Rainier, and there's a lot of possibilities. A quick view here of some of the other volcanoes. This is Mount Adams, second highest volcano and peak, of course, in the Cascade Range. It's really a very, very pretty and interesting mountain. A climb I did once on the east face of Adams. There are some steep snow and ice gullies, also ridges. And then going back to the North Cascades, it's like powder snow skiing at the very best that you can get in both Canada or Montana or Utah, Colorado. You don't get this kind of snow very often, but this was near Washington Pass on one of the ski trips I made in there during some very, very good conditions. Ski tour I made just 2 years ago near Mount Baker, which is in the North Cascades. During the middle of winter, I think there were 5 of us. We all wore avalanche beacons. We took 2 dogs along that wanted to get some practice in running around in deep snow. And just to be sure the dogs came home, we also put avalanche beacons on them. Weekend later, went down, it was raining, all the powder snow turned to mush, so I decided to take a trip to Portland to do some work on a history book, and then took a hiking trip into a gorge along the Columbia River. And it's kind of interesting. You see the trail cut right blasted actually into a real vertical basalt column, and there's some amazingly interesting little creeks and waterfalls coming, such as Bridal Veil Falls here in the Columbia and the Mount Noma Falls. Kind of an interesting place to visit, especially on a rainy day because of the greenery effect, and you can get very, very interesting pictures. A winter climb of Mount Jefferson, second highest volcano in Oregon. This was done on just an absolutely perfect day, about the middle of February, and from the top of Mount Jefferson on a perfect day with no wind, you can look northward here toward Mount Hood, which is the big pyramid, and that's one of the more famous volcanoes, maybe the most famous. It actually gets climbed even more than Mount Rainier, and it's the highest mountain in the state of Oregon. Flying over the Sisters, very close to Mount Bachelor ski area, and also not very far from Smith Rocks, are the Sisters. There's three main sisters there, then Broken Top. And it's a wonderful place in Central Oregon. You can do some easy climbs and also some moderate ones on glaciers in the Sisters, and also some great fishing and hiking along the Cascade Crest Trail during the middle of the summer. Climbing on Stein's Pillar, which is a big overhanging monolith about 400 feet high. It actually overhangs all the way across, so the route kind of winds around the peak sort of like a spiral. And it was first climbed by some Oregon State College students who actually spent parts of 3 different vacations climbing and drilling holes most of the way up. You have to be very careful that you rappel down the correct way, that you land on a ledge, otherwise you might find yourself hanging out in space and not being able to get back to your rappel position. It'd be pretty embarrassing to be stuck out there. Lassen Peak, which is the southernmost of all the volcanoes in the Cascade Range, is south actually of Mount Shasta, and there's no glaciers on Lassen, but the white that you see is all fresh snow from a fall snowstorm. A few random shots of climbing in the Sawtooth Range in Idaho, which actually is not this far from Missoula. I found some really interesting rock climbing and also some beautiful hiking country in the Sawtooth Range. It takes about 15 minutes to take a motorboat across Redfish Lake, just time to drink 1 beer. A few random shots of climbing. This is actually a climb of a tower called Big Bear and Spire, which we climbed by cracks in chimney systems, except for the final summit monolith, which is about 80 feet high. We had to put a ladder of bolts up to get to the very, very summit. A rock wall called Elephant's Perch, which I guess now is the most popular technical climbing area in the Sawtooth Range. I'm sure some of you have done some routes on this. We did the first route on Elephant's Perch, and of course since that time there's been about 10 other ones. But the rock is very good, and it's a fairly good access there. A shot taken during that same climb. The Sawtooth Range not only has some, like I said, some great climbing, but also some good hiking and many, many really beautiful alpine lakes.